morning's plenary session is concerned with research and three very important aspects of research. They are trust, impact, and workflows, or how research happens. So beginning, we have David Nicholas from Cyber Research and Carol Tenopir from the University of Tennessee talking about trust and the role trust plays in helping researchers decide how to do their work, where to publish, what to cite, and aspects like that. David is director of the Cyber Research Group, who are interested in monitoring virtual behaviors. And Carol is Chancellor's Professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. So they are going to be discussing the results of a recent study funded by Sloan Foundation that used focus groups, interviews, and surveys to discover how academics now view trust of scholarly content. So I'll invite them, I think Carol's going to speak and David's available for questions. And if there's time at the end of each session, we will take questions. If not, we'll take some questions at the end. So do make a note of any questions you have as the speakers talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be back at UKSG. This is one of my favorite meetings, and so I always like to have the opportunity to come here. Dave and I were going to do a duet today, but Dave has a bit of a cough, and so I should say his singing voice is not so good. So I'm going to do the presentation, but he'll be here to answer questions. And what we're talking about is a study we have done together that focuses on both the US and UK and indeed part of it internationally, looking at the role of trust in scholars and researchers' interaction with scholarly content. As was mentioned, this was funded by the Sloan Foundation, and I wanted to give a special thanks to several publishers that helped us arrange the focus group. So it was very nice to have some assistance in getting facilities and getting helping recruit participants. And so thank you especially to Taylor and Francis, Sage, plus Biomed Central, Wiley, and Elsevier for helping with some of those logistics. The study had really two main aims, and the first is to see what role does trust play right now in how people interact, how researchers interact with scholarly content. And the second is to see how they perceive that things may be changing, and for us to look at clues for things that might have been changing from the past. And I think one thing that was particularly important about this study is the recognition that any scholar, any academic, plays many roles, and that the role of trust, or more specifically trustworthiness and quality, and how do you judge something as trustworthy or of high quality, may be different when the same person is looking at something to read, looking at something to decide to cite for a paper, and then choosing a venue to publish or disseminate the results. So we were looking at the interaction of those three roles. And we also wanted to look at does trust differ by the types of sources? So for example, do you have different trust metrics when you're trying to decide whether to read or cite or disseminate a traditional journal article versus a blog or some other kind of content? So we were looking at differences in role of academics as well as type of material. We used multiple methods to study this, and the first thing we did was focus groups. And the focus groups and then follow-up in-depth interviews really were looking at UK and US. So we focused on those two countries. Lots of focus groups with lots of participants as well as interviews. And then that helped us design a questionnaire that went to a broader audience. In all, we had nearly 4,000 participants in this research project, and gave us some good insights into not only how things are now, but how things may be changing. So I'm going to give you some overall findings. As you can imagine, a study of this size, there's lots of things I could say, but I'm going to try to give you some highlights of the findings, and then also a few of the implications for publishers and librarians. From work that's been done in the past by us and by others, we know that there are traditional indicators of trust in traditional kinds of materials like journal articles. So we know that journal name, journal reputation, and author expertise have traditionally been those trust metrics that are the highest, whether it's for reading, citing, or publishing. And a study we did several years ago showed that if you looked at all of the factors together, a well-known journal with a high impact factor by a known high-quality author has the highest trustworthy score, no surprise. But what began to creep in a bit, also trustworthy, was some access sorts of things. So people said, well, yes, those things are important, but I need to be able to get to it easily and with no charge to me as a reader, so that kind of clouds or influences trust. So that led us to think of, what else is going on in trust besides the obvious and traditional kinds of metrics for quality. So when we started the focus groups and interviews, some reality checks hit us quite hard right from the beginning. It became quite clear that trust is somewhat of a nebulous sort of thing in the sense that it does vary depending on whether you're reading, citing, or publishing. So right from the beginning, the academics said, well, yes, they trust some things that they would never, ever cite. And Wikipedia was mentioned now as something that's trustworthy from a reader's perspective. And many of them, as you know, will go to Wikipedia first, but they also use it as a gateway to find trustworthy material, but are very hesitant to cite it. And one of the reasons they're very hesitant to cite things that they may trust as quality for reading is that it's a quite complicated, trust becomes quite complicated when you look at citing and publishing, because politics and policies influence citing and publishing a lot. That is expectations of your university, what you've been told to do by your research professors, what you perceive as the norms in your discipline, for example, all influence that kind of decision-making of something going from trusted in reading to trusted in citing or publishing. When it comes to citing, there's all sorts of additional things that influence that. So several participants mentioned they cite to show that they know what they're talking about, that they're citing the most important that they perceive as trusted by a wider community. So even though they may trust something to read it, they do this second stage sort of, will this be trusted and show that I am a trustworthy scholar by citing the things that others might perceive as high quality. And publishing, of course, and the choice of how to disseminate gets very clouded by what's going to help my career, further my career. And something that may not surprise you, but I think always surprises me, is that often the younger academics are more conservative than the older when it comes to publishing or disseminating, because the idea that I'm building my career and I have to think about what others perceive as trust and trustworthy and high quality venues to be able to disseminate my work, and so that I have to think about something beyond my own perceptions. And of course it became very clear that there are different criteria or cascading criteria or complex criteria when we're looking at trust for reading, trust for citing, and trust for publishing. So I want to look at those separate because they are indeed quite separate. So the first is in reading. And trust in reading has become complex. Perhaps it always was, but I think it's becoming even more complex than it has. So many of the participants say the first thing they do to decide whether a source is trustworthy is they look at the abstract and the methodology. It's interesting because it wasn't too many years ago that there were lots of predictions that abstracts would become obsolete if we can navigate through the full text of of an article or any other kind of information container. Why do we need an abstract? But clearly a vast majority of the 4,000 academics we worked with talked about needing to test something first, to look and see is this trustworthy based on content, and an abstract and the methodology are a good place to start. They also then say that they look to see if there's credible data. Now, what's interesting is the vast majority do not have data sets attached. There's a lot of talk at this conference on data. So they're looking at the data that is presented or the analysis of the data and the logic of the argument. And then finally, looking at the references. So navigating throughout the document and to go look at the references. Here's that second stage of trust. Does this person cite the sources that I think are trustworthy? And so that's some of the complexity there. The next group of trust metrics for reading has to do with somebody who I trust recommends it to me. So there is another kind of second stage. A colleague recommends it, therefore I read it. Or I know the author, or I know of the author, and that's, so that means that this will probably be good. And then lastly, the traditional metrics do remain. Familiarity with journal title is still very important in many disciplines, in most disciplines and with many researchers. There is still, over and over again, we hear people say that peer review equals quality, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And impact factor seems to be still very widely recognized, so again, I'll return to that as well. So if I look at these in terms of categories, the first are what I would call navigational metrics. There is this necessity of navigating throughout a document to be able to judge trust and trustworthiness and quality. The next are social metrics, if you will. This is someone recommends it, or I know somebody, this kind of connectiveness sort of metric. And the third are what I've labeled as traditional metrics. That is those things that have been true for a long time, that this is a known journal, or this has the metrics that I have grown up to recognize, and those have not disappeared. I think perhaps I mentioned again sometimes that what surprises us more than anything is not so much the change, although there are changes, but the things that haven't changed as well in some of the conservative kind of reliance. So citing is a different aspect of trust. For citing, the number 1, 2, and 3 methods when we ask people to rank trustworthiness in how to determine something to cite were all about known and trusted authority. And they mentioned author first, journal name second, and a known conference, particularly in fields like computer science where conferences are important. So something that is recognized, known, has that aura of trust that will be conveyed to others as I cite something to let someone know that I am aware of the important literature. It was also mentioned that you want to cite something that's important in the field, a seminal work in the field. This requires and implies expertise to know what that is, and so those kinds of clues for somebody who's doing interdisciplinary work are more difficult. It was interesting, lots of people mentioned they cite something that supports their methodology. When we asked people to rank factors, one of the factors we had is something that was a good explanation of an alternative methodology, and that was one of the very lowest ranked trust factors. So I want something that supports my methodology when I'm deciding to cite it. And then also ranked very highly was, I knew of this, maybe didn't know this individual, but I know this research group, or I know this institution, and it is considered trustworthy. For determining where to publish, a different picture. Again, traditional metrics, again, are still quite surprisingly important. Impact factor seems to be very widely known and recognized. Very often, the respondents said that where they publish is very much determined by the promotion criteria, the policies of their university, and they see that upper-level administration or research evaluation or excellence frameworks or any kind of judging of them. Impact factor is something that they can convey. I'm publishing in these top journals, and they see that there needs to be something that's very clearly understood. But they also look at the audience of a journal. Is this one like, does this attract the kind of people I want reading my things? And therefore, it's trust by implication, or that's kind of social metric of it's got the audience that will understand me, therefore it's a good choice. And then, of course, there's always reality. It's the reality not so much of trust, but if it fits within these other criteria, where am I likely to get published, and that helps make the decision. There are differences based on subject discipline and age, as you might expect. Life science researchers, for example, say they are more likely to trust for both citing and publishing and reading, an open access journal if it is peer reviewed. And again, the peer review comes out over and over again as important. Humanities researchers say they feel more pressure and feel more inclined to trust for citing and publishing those things that are quite traditional rather than non-traditional. So there are some differences based on subject discipline. There are also quite a few differences, as you might expect, based on age. Younger researchers, and we have defined that these are researchers who have their degree, they're academic staff in universities, so that's 40 and under, although we do have their exact age, we can separate it for under 30s and different kind of categories. But those half that are under 40 are more likely to say they trust non-traditional methods of dissemination, particularly for reading, that they're more inclined to read what would be considered non-traditional, but also to think about trust for dissemination. But the reality is, because of politics, they might consider it, but they don't actually disseminate their own work as often there because of that reality of pressure. So we've got a confliction going on, which may actually indicate a change may come in the future. I trust it, but I can't publish in it because the folks above me who are judging me may not trust it. So second-guessing trust of other, if you will, because if I'm going to get grants, if I want to get promoted, et cetera, I've got to go for traditional metrics of trust. Younger researchers say they are more likely to cite people they know because they trust them, so they really are using these social metrics. It's true of all, but more likely for the younger researchers. And younger researchers also said they're more likely to cite open access journals, again, if properly peer reviewed. So there is a difference here. There is a lot of confusion about open access in terms of quality versus an economic model. Huge confusion. Seems slightly less so among the younger researchers, more likely to say that as long as I know that they can be peer reviewed or not peer reviewed, and that I'm more likely to cite an open access journal. Whereas we had a lot of older academics who thought open access meant non-peer reviewed and would not. So that, again, a lot of confusion. So across the board, peer review is still the coin of the realm. And when people were talking about peer review, they were talking mostly about pre-peer review, not post-peer review. We hear a lot at meetings like this about the idea of completely open and post-publication peer review. But they were talking about something that when they read it, they could trust it because it had already undergone peer review. And this got mentioned over and over and over again, and for reading, for citing, and for publishing. But people recognize, and focus groups are a great way to get into the howevers, they recognize there are problems with peer review, which again may be another indication of changes to come. So we got a lot of comments, open-ended in the surveys, as well as comments in the interviews and the focus groups, that people recognized that there are problems with peer review. They recognize it might be difficult to publish something that goes against the current trends, that the high-impact journals may not want to take something that's kind of outside the current trends. They recognize that if it's not blind peer review, that the author, that those metrics of author trust may influence the peer reviewers. And so somebody who is new in a field may not have as much of a chance of getting into a journal or into a publication venue as somebody who is well known. And they also expressed a worry that the opinions might be, that peer review may not be always exactly fair or unbiased, and so they recognize this. However, even though people recognize it, they still, over and over again, say it is essential to scholarship and it is our essential metric of trust. That peer review is something that is recognized by the people above them and recognized by them, and they are still very much influenced by something being peer review, no matter the problems that may come. I mentioned I'd come back to impact factor. And impact factor, we spend a lot of time at meetings like this talking about other kinds of ways to measure and what's wrong and what's right with impact factor. Impact factor is something that seems to be widely recognized internationally, very considered as an important trust factor, particularly of what to read or cite, and as well as publish. So it's all of them. Publishing, absolutely essential because of the politics of promotion, but also the idea of I'm going to decide what to read based on it. Again, there is a recognition of the dark side. There's a recognition that high impact factor publications, journals can publish low quality articles and they may lack innovative papers. But the idea that this is something that is understood and I understand it and I don't understand all this other stuff makes it still important. And again, this is another one of those conservative, and when it comes to publishing, young academics are told they need to publish in the high impact factor journals, and so that's where they often go. Altmetrics is a term that did not come up. So altmetrics as a word is not necessarily recognized like as a group like this is, but some things that are altmetrics do come up. So when we asked specifically about the concept, most didn't know what it was. They didn't know the word. In the U.S. focus groups, we didn't mention it, and it never came up. In the UK focus groups, it was asked about, and people didn't know what it was. When some of the altmetrics were explained or mentioned, there was a fair amount of skepticism about what they really meant. So for example, does the fact that something's been downloaded, does that mean that it is of high quality or that I can trust it? So there is some skepticism of, do they have meaning? But they want something that can be easily understood. They have to make a judgment to what to read quite quickly. So they want something that they can really sink their teeth into or very quickly. And it has to be something that can be understood for what they publish and cite by others. However, if you turn that on its head and don't use the word altmetric, but talk about what would you like to see associated with the work that you do, when you're putting on your author hat, many people said, well, they like to see how many times somebody looks at their work or cites their work or downloads their work. So in other words, altmetrics from a publishing point of view were actually quite popular, even though the word wasn't used. So yes, I do like to see who's tweeting my work, who's referring to my work, who is downloading my work, or not who, but how many. So again, I think some indicators of change, that those are things that are valuable, even if they're not, even if they don't know exactly what to call them. And I think this quote sums up this idea that change may be coming. This was a young academic when we asked, how is trust different in a completely online environment? This is somebody who most of their reading, publishing, and citing is in an online environment, not in a print world. And we had many quotes like this, but this idea that connectiveness through the name of a friend who sent you a link, and it has to be connected to others. I mean, this is a real social metric. This is an indication that trust is changing in a sense of it's enabled. It was probably always there, of trusted friend, but it's enabled now through social media, through easily connecting, that's something that is absolutely important. I want to finish up with just a few brief words. Open access, incredible confusion, and a lot of people said they're more confused now than they were a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago. People talk about getting 10, 15 emails a day from open access publishers asking them to publish. They don't know whether they can trust them. They don't know, it's quite confusing. They did mention PLOS ONE as a trustworthy brand name, but lots of confusion. Too expensive, it must be lower quality, mustn't it? Quick publication time, but there must not be peer review. This incredible confusion. Not being able to distinguish quality, trustworthiness from the economic gold open access anyway. So a lot of suspicion, and seems to be a growing suspicion rather than a decrease in suspicion. So let me conclude here and talk about some of our overall findings. First, again, there seems to be a clinging, if you will, to known trust metrics. And whether it's something known or something new, people need to be able to judge trust quickly. Lots of information available to read, to publish, and to cite. How can I quickly see something that helps me know that this is high quality and trustworthy? The second is, as I mentioned, open access is confusing, and people don't really know and getting more confused. Tenure and promotion policies influence trust a lot, particularly for citing and publishing. And the other is that people do say they look through, that to be able to navigate and read through something is really important. So navigational features in an online environment are particularly important and help judge trust. So let me finish there so we have a chance to ask some questions. And the papers from this are beginning to come out now, so I'm glad to answer questions, be contacted, and look for some of the results for this. So thank you very much.